Hey there, I hope you're doing well today. I love this time of year. I don't know about you, but with the summer solstice coming upon us, these are some of the longest days of the year, and I absolutely love it. The garden is flourishing, and in many cases, so much has already started to harvest, which brings me to today's topic, which is a common question that I get this time of year. What can we plant after those cool season crops have harvested? I'm talking about broccoli, carrots, cabbage, lettuce, onions, or even potatoes. Now, if you're new, you may wonder, why is this even a question? Or if you have not harvested any of these things yet, you may wonder, does this even apply to me? So let's talk about a couple of those things. First, if you are new, you may not be familiar with the fact that there are cool season crops and there are warm season crops. And when you plant cool season crops at the right time, which is usually the late winter to the early spring, they will harvest and you will have some of your season left. And in many cases, in my case, you'll have a lot of your season left. This will apply to almost all gardeners except for those in the shortest of growing seasons. But what you decide to plant after those cool season crops harvest does depend on your season. For me in Arkansas, that means that I have plenty of time to get one, if not two more summer crops in. If you're in a shorter season, you may go from spring cool season crop and then harvest that to fall cool season crop. So it really just kind of depends on where you're located. But regardless, most likely, once you harvest those cool season crops, you will have places to plant new things in your garden and you can get more harvest than you ever thought possible. So today we're going to talk about how to know what to plant after your cool season crops harvest, depending on your growing season. First things first though, if you're new, let's dive just a little bit deeper into why this is even a question. I want to make sure that what we talk about here is relevant not only to those of us who have had experience gardening in the past, but also for brand new beginners. And so what I want to make sure that you understand is that cool season crops are some of the first crops that you plant in the spring and in the late winter. For so many of these crops, you plant them early because they don't love the heat. And most of us honestly figure this out the hard way. So for example, if you are new and you realize that you planted too late because maybe your broccoli, where you expect to have heads, they're starting to form flowers, which means they're bolting. If that starts to happen, it happens to all of us. Or if you have lettuce growing and you harvest it and you realize, man, that's really bitter, then you have realized how important it is to grow cool season crops in the cool season because they don't like the heat. And if that happens to you, you are not alone. It happens to all of us, I think. And all you need to do at this point is understand that for the most part, those crops are going to be done for the spring, especially if you live in an area where it gets hot. But you can plan on planting them in the fall. Many of them, almost all of them, you can plant in the fall. So it's not like it's completely lost for the entire year. You just may need to start over in the fall. Also, if you're new, please know that some crops and some climates are kind of difficult in this. Please know also that if you're new, some crops, and especially in some climates like mine where we go from cool to hot really fast, this may take you some seasons to get dialed in. After so many years of failure in growing spring broccoli, I actually just gave up for several years until I started learning how to grow broccoli, and I switched varieties. I started doing a variety that actually is a heading variety, and it's slower days to maturity. Green Magic is the main one, but I've been able to actually venture out into some other varieties once I figured it out and dialed it in. So all that to say, it's okay to take a break if you're frustrated, if this is happening to you, but understand that this can happen to all of us and we just adjust as we go on. And you're not a bad gardener. You're not alone. We just have to learn. In my southern location in Arkansas, we are zone 8B. We have an average last frost date now of April 8th. Cool season crops are very sensitive to heat and will start bolting or going to flower or getting bitter in the case of lettuce when temperatures rise into the 80s. And for me, this is usually late April to early May. And because of that, it's really important to plant early. So this is something for you to make sure that you know if you're new, especially going into next spring. Bank this information for the future because it's going to be really important for you next spring. But maybe you enjoy a longer, milder spring than I do. Well, in this case, you may not be in such a rush to get your plants in the ground like I am. You might be able to plant those later, or maybe you were able to plant them later and you're not seeing any evidence of bolting or bitterness. Then you have a little bit more flexibility. The key here is to really learn your climate. You can learn this by obviously observation. That's how I did it. Lots of years of trial and error and lots of error. Or you can ask other gardeners and get a feel for the rhythms of your climate. But it's really important to understand that different climates are going to be different. So with everything I'm saying today, please make sure to put this in context to your personal location. To sum up, the first reason why we get cool season crops in the ground earlier and we're harvesting earlier is because they don't like the heat. But there's a second reason why you may be harvesting these cool season crops earlier than you think, which means that you're going to have other opportunities for new crops. And that is because many of the cool season crops that you're growing actually don't take as long to come to maturity and to harvest as you may think. If you think about it, if you look at most lettuce packets, if you're growing from seed or even if you're growing from transplant, they will take between typically 50 to 60 days to harvest. Some of them may take as long as 75, just depending on the crop, but we're talking about 2 months, right? So if you're planting, like if I'm planting my lettuce in March, that means that even if we didn't get hot really fast, the crop would be harvestable by mid-May anyway. The same is true with broccoli. Again, most of the broccoli that I grow, 55 days. So if I'm planting in March, I'm harvesting usually the beginning of May, if not late April, just depending on the season, when I plant it, the temperatures, all that stuff. And the same with beets and carrots, 55 to 65 days. So most of these, or many of these cool season crops will only take about 2 months from the time either they sprout or the time that you put a transplant in the ground until you're harvesting them. So it's not a long season like you would think of with tomatoes or watermelon or some of your other summer crops. You're actually going to get these quicker than you think. Now, some cool season crops do take a little bit longer, like potatoes. Potatoes can take 3 to 4 months, maybe even more, depending on what variety that you plant. Cabbage can take 2 to 3 months depending on what variety you plant. That's another thing to look at closely with cabbage. Some cabbage will only take a couple of months. The kind that I grow does. It's a smaller head, but if you grow one of those cabbages with ginormous heads, it's going to take a little bit longer, obviously. So understand that some of them can take longer than 2 months, but so many of them have a days to maturity of about 2 months. Now, one thing to consider too, though, is if you direct sow these seeds directly in the garden, the cool soil temperature will tend to make it take a little bit longer than those 2 months. For example, with carrots, when you're planting carrots directly, the seeds directly in the ground, you're probably going to have to wait about 2 weeks for those sprouts to emerge. And then when those sprouts emerge, that's when the clock starts as far as days to maturity. It's not the day that you plant them, it's the day that they sprout. Now, you may see various definitions of that online, and some definitions will say it starts at the time that you plant the seed. I personally have found that being able to count when they sprout is more accurate because different seeds sprout at different times depending on the soil, depending on how wet it is, this time of year, that kind of thing. So I will always count it from the time it sprouts. Or if you're planting it as a transplant, you're going to start that time when you plant the transplant in the ground, no matter when you planted from seed indoors. For example, if I started broccoli from seed 6 weeks or 4 weeks before I planted in the ground, I'm still starting that timer with the days to maturity when I get it in the ground. And that way I know to expect a couple of months after I get the broccoli in the ground, or a couple of months after that first carrot sprout emerges. Then I'm looking at about 2 months for harvest. But again, sometimes this is affected by temperature. If you have a really cool spring, you'll notice that you can add a little bit of time to that. For me, I think I sowed my carrot seeds at the end of February this year, and I started harvesting at the middle of May, I think. So that was a little bit longer than 2 months. I think a lot of that, well, part of it was because it took them a couple of weeks to germinate. But then also, if you have a more cool than normal spring, or if you have a lot of cloudy days, you may notice that the growth is not as rapid at the beginning. So that can also affect when you're going to harvest. I share all of this so that you can know why we're even talking about this. And that's because you will be harvesting your cool season crops in many cases when you have plenty of time to plant another crop after it. That's what we're going to be talking about next. So what are the options to plant after cool season crops? Whether they bolt, whether they get bitter, or whether you simply harvest them sooner than you expected. And I think all of those have happened to me, depending on the year, depending on the crop. I can't tell you how many times I expected to harvest potatoes, later in the year, because that's when I see other gardeners, maybe in the northern part of the US, harvesting their potatoes. It's like an August harvest. And I was shocked when I was harvesting mine at the beginning of June. That happened to me one of my first years of growing potatoes. And then I was left with, what am I going to do with all this space? It's the beginning of June, or sometimes they'll go into July depending on the season, but still I have so much more time left in my season. Now what? Well, here are some of the crops that you can plant depending on your climate. So let me just back up and say, these are some of the crops that you could consider planting after these cool season crops have harvested, assuming that you have enough time left in your growing season. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some warm season crops, but please understand that if you live in an area where you're harvesting many of these cool season crops in July or August, you're going to want to probably go directly to fall crops. You're probably not going to have time for many of these warm season crops. However, a few of them you might. So it just depends on your climate. It depends on the days to maturity of these crops, and we'll talk about those one by one as we go through these. So the first consideration that I like to make when it comes to planting crops after some of these cool season crops is I love to consider hot weather loving crops. That's because in Arkansas, we get hot and we get really hot, and some crops just do better in that higher heat. These are crops that are going to do well when the nights are consistently in the 60s or above. And many times in the summer, we're always in the 70s, but at least in the 60s. And they like days in the 80s or above. And the soil temperature is at least 70 degrees. And that's what you're going to see when you harvest these cool season crops. Many times, all of these boxes are checked. Your nights are in the 60s, days are in the 80s. Soil temperatures are in the 70s. This is especially true if you're harvesting because of bitterness, bolting, because it's not just the temperature, the air temperature that causes these plants to get bitter or bolt. It's also the soil temperature. And the temperatures that cause these crops to get bitter or bolt are also the temperatures that these hot weather crops are going to enjoy. Number one would be okra. Okra is a heat-loving crop, and if you are not in an area where you think you can grow okra, there are some workarounds on that. Number one, you can grow a dwarf type okra or a smaller okra, because if it doesn't get super tall, it's probably going to start harvesting a little bit earlier, so you can pick and choose what variety you use. You can also sow okra seeds indoors ahead of time. This year was the first time that I tried this. I've never needed to because I'm in Arkansas, and if we sow the seeds and it gets warm, okra loves it and I don't need to. But this year I decided to sow some indoors because I was going to plant okra in the middle of my garlic. And at the time I needed to plant okra, that garlic was really flush and beautiful, and it was just going to cause too much shade. So I planted my okra seeds indoors just to give the garlic some time to kind of start dying back a little bit and open it up for that sun. And those plants are thriving. Now, I did plant them in the deep Epic cell trays, which were, 4 to 6 inches deep. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they were the deeper ones. And I felt like that was really good because that taproot of the okra had more room to be able to grow. But to get a jump start on okra, you could start indoors. And it may be too late by the time you're listening to this to do this, but it might be something to consider in the future. So again, okra loves the heat, so this would be ideal to follow some of your cool season crops. Sweet potatoes are also an option if you have a long, warm season climate area. So The thing with sweet potatoes is that they do take a long time to come to harvest, usually 3 to 4 months at least, depending on the variety. And if you're living in a place where you're not harvesting your cool season crops until July or even June, you may not have enough time to get sweet potatoes to a harvest if you follow those crops with sweet potatoes. They would probably need to be started a little bit sooner. But because sweet potatoes do love the heat and my season is really long and I don't harvest sweet potatoes till October usually anyway, then I can get away with planting sweet potatoes a little bit later and following them. For me, I followed my broccoli and my green stalk with some sweet potatoes. That's a new experiment for me. And then I also followed carrots with sweet potatoes in one of my raised beds. And that particular planting was at the end of May, on Memorial Day, actually. And we'll see, that's the latest I've ever planted them, but I'm not worried about them because we have such a long season, we should be fine. Another option would be peppers. Peppers are a great option to follow many cool season crops because, again, they do not like the cool weather. This was something I'll probably share with you a little bit more, and I think I already did touch on this in a previous podcast episode, but I am learning that it is really important not to plant peppers too early. The peppers that I planted when it was earlier than I would have wanted it to be, but they were outgrowing their containers and we had a really nice warm spell. Those peppers are not thriving like the ones that I waited 2 weeks and waited until we got past one last cold snap. I think they're going to rebound and they're going to be fine. But the difference between the peppers that I planted once it got warm and the ones that I planted too early is night and day. Completely different. So by waiting a little bit longer and planting peppers after some of those cool season crops come out, you may actually have a stronger plant. At least that's what I'm observing in my garden this year. That might actually produce better for you. Now, if you, again, live in a shorter season, you may not get bell peppers completely ripe, to the red stage if you want them, but you could definitely do something like a smaller pepper, a jalapeno, all sorts of peppers that don't get huge. That would be a really good option. Another option would be eggplant. I've noticed the same thing with eggplant. I planted some eggplant too soon. They got really attacked by flea beetles, and I ended up taking one out and replacing it with one that I didn't plant as soon. And so the same thing, the eggplant really likes the heat. That's a great option to plant after your cool season crops. And number 5 on my hot weather loving crops would be black-eyed peas. This is probably more of an option for those of you who have longer seasons, who have long, hot summers like we do, because black-eyed peas definitely will do fine in the heat. I have never had them stop flowering or stop producing in the heat. So these would be an ideal option after cool season crops. And you plant them from seed directly in that warm soil and they will take off. So those are the 5 hot weather crops that I would consider planting after your cool season crops. But many of these are kind of longer season harvests. So you may not have a lot of time to be able to plant some of these. And you may be wondering, is there another warm season crop that you can plant that maybe you're not in a long season area where these would work? Well, warm season crops are actually options too, especially the ones that are faster to maturity. They have lower days to maturity, usually in the 2-month range. They also can be grown in a shorter season just because they don't take that long to come to a harvest. You can fit these in a small window. If you have a couple of months between your cool season crop harvest and when you would start planting your fall crops, then you can fit these in. And then another thing is that all of these you can directly sow from seed directly in the garden. And because the soil temperature has warmed sufficiently, then they are going to germinate fast, usually within a couple of days. So you can get fast germination and you can get quick establishment, which should yield a quicker harvest. And these are summer squash or zucchini. I love plugging these in the middle of the summer just because they are so quick to harvest. The second one would be green beans. Most of us would choose to plant bush beans at this point, just because it'd be a little bit later in the season. But if you have a really long growing season, you could probably do pole beans as well. But bush beans are definitely a great option. And I have a lot of people ask me, what's my favorite bush bean? So far, I have not found anything that I like better than jade. That's my favorite bush bean. And then also cucumbers. Cucumbers are fantastic to be able to sow in the middle of the summer. They don't particularly mind the heat. They harvest pretty quickly. And as long as you keep them watered, sometimes people say that the heat causes the fruit to be bitter. I have found that it's more of a water issue, which obviously if it's hotter, then you're going to have to water more. But another workaround around that is certain types of cucumbers don't tend to get bitter. I think it's the Armenian cucumbers. Suyo Long was one that I planted a couple of years ago. It seems like there was another one, but they tend to be really long cucumbers. I've never had any issues with those getting bitter. But I do say this because a lot of times if you're just growing the regular everyday cucumber, you may find in the summer that they could get a little bit bitter. Again, I think most of that has to do with water than it does the heat, but you can avoid that by planting some that tend not to get bitter. But anyway, warm season crops are really good options because you can get them planted and you can get them harvested and then still have time for a fall crop a little bit later. There are also a couple other warm season crops that I would throw in there as options after your cool season crops, depending on your season. Number one would be melons. This is something that I am following my cabbage with watermelons, but I'm specifically choosing smaller watermelons, not your large 30 pounders. I probably could still do that, but in my experience, I don't really crave watermelon in September and October, even if they're harvesting then. I really like my melons a little bit earlier, so I'm planting some smaller melons because those smaller ones are going to come to harvest quicker. And then you can direct sow them like I did. They will sprout really fast in warm soil, as you have heard me mention many times, but you can also plant them as a transplant to get a little bit extra head start on those. Another option, if you have the space, would be corn. Corn is one I really enjoy planting after cool season crops because in my garden, I have found that if I plant them a little bit later, I get to avoid a lot of the windstorms that come in the early part of the summer, the late part of the spring. And then also they don't seem to mind the heat. And in my garden, I found they're not as susceptible to the corn earworm, although I've had other gardeners tell me that that worm is way worse in the later part of the year. So definitely observe that, but I found they're not as bad. But make sure, corn is a very heavy feeder, so make sure that you amend your soil with extra nitrogen, especially if you're following a cool season crop that loved nitrogen with corn. For example, if you're following corn, if you're following brassicas, those love nitrogen, so you definitely need to add some more nitrogen because corn definitely needs that. You can also plant tomatoes after your cool season crops. This would be a great option if you're trying to get multiple harvests of tomatoes, or if you live in an area like mine where disease tends to be a problem or the heat tends to be a problem and tomatoes just start cooking in the middle of the heat. It's not a bad idea to start with a fresh, younger plant after your cool season crops have harvested. Just take special care at when you plant them. Use shade cloth for a while if you need to, especially if you're planting them in the heat of the summer. But this would be an option for you to follow some cool season crops with to be able to get maybe a later harvest of tomatoes. Those 11 crops then: okra, sweet potatoes, peppers, eggplant, black-eyed peas, summer squash or zucchini, green beans, cucumbers, melons, corn and tomatoes. I think those are great options for you to consider after you pull up your cool season crops. But as I kind of alluded to before, don't forget to amend your soil between plantings. The key to succession planting effectively in order to get lots of harvest is that not only is it great to make sure that you're succession planting, period, that you're not just, done with a crop and then move on with your life, but you've got a crop coming in behind it. The key besides that is to make sure that your soil has enough fertility to support that second crop. And in many cases, that third crop. In my garden, I've got at least 3, sometimes 4 crops in one space throughout the season, just depending on the crop, sometimes 2, if I have a couple of long season crops. But the whole point is sometimes I have 4 successive crops going in one growing season. And all of those are taking up lots of nutrients. And I've got to make sure to amend with compost between each planting. And if I'm planting something that I know is going to need a little extra nitrogen or a little extra fertility of some sort, sometimes I will throw in a slow release fertilizer like Plant Tone or Garden Tone. but usually I just amend with compost and I find that that is sufficient. And also, as I mentioned before, this bears repeating, observe. This is really, really important because your climate is going to be different than mine. Most likely. I know I've got a lot of people from Arkansas and similar climates that listen. And obviously, a lot of the stuff that I'm saying here can be applied to you. But if you're in a different climate than mine, you definitely need to observe. And even if your climate rhythms are the same, but you live in a different part of the country, your pests are going to be a little different. So I'm talking about the corn earworm. You may find that your climate is cookie cutter to mine, but your pests are different. So understand that you've got to observe your particular garden and then you adjust. Sometimes it takes multiple years to really learn the rhythms of what is planted and what is harvested when in your garden, because sometimes years are different. For example, I'm really hopeful with my potato harvest this year because when I planted my potatoes, I was able to plant them early because we had a little bit of an early warm up, and then we didn't have a ton of rain at the beginning, so I was able to plant them without the seeds rotting. That is what I've done in the past with the best potato harvest. But I've also had other years where we've had a long, cold spring with lots of rain, and then I wasn't able to plant the potatoes as early, so that meant I was harvesting them later. My earliest potato harvest has been early June, but my latest one has been mid-July, just in same varieties, but that depended on the particular climate. Now, honestly, I haven't found that any other crops are that variable, but understand that it may take you multiple years to really start honing in on the rhythms of your particular climate in regard to your particular crops. But what you'll find, especially with the experience that you have, is you'll start to know in your head when things are harvesting. You'll be able to say, okay, yes, I know this is about the time that I harvest this. And it helps because not only are you able to go out there and, especially with root crops, with carrots, you can look at the tops and you can see when they're really lush and vibrant and standing up, they're probably still growing. But then when they start to kind of fall a little bit and they're really large, and you're like, oh yeah, and I've done this before. Oh yeah, I probably need to check to see if they're ready. And sometimes they're past ready because I wasn't really thinking through, okay, this is about the time that I need to harvest this. So you'll learn that as you get experience, and you'll start to develop a rhythm, and you start to know when harvests come and then what you want to plant afterwards. And then once you start to really hone in on this makes garden planning so much easier and fun, because when you're planning your garden in the wintertime, you'll be able to know, okay, last year I harvested my garlic in the beginning of June, and I know that I have time to be able to plant this crop afterwards, whatever that ends up being. We talked about 11 options at this point, right? In planning this, I'm just going to put a bug in your ear for this, and many of you guys recognize this, but in planning this is something that I teach you how to do in my online course, Dream to Garden. It's a course where I teach you how to plan your garden. It's not open right now. I think we're going to open it again in November, so that those of you guys who want to get a head start on next year's garden planning, you'll be able to join then. But I do want to let you know that everything that I'm teaching you in today's episode is something that I walk you through how to put in place precisely in your garden in that garden planning course. But until then, what you can do to set yourself up, whether you join Dream to Garden in November or next spring, or whether you're already a student now, it is really important for you to observe, when am I harvesting these things? And then if you're going to follow it with something like I shared with you today, observe, did it work? Was there a challenge there? One thing that I did one year was I did follow a cool season crop with tomatoes. And I think I planted those tomatoes in the middle of July. And I realized after losing about half of them that I didn't take proper measures to be able to make sure that they didn't just die in the heat. I should have put shade cloth on them. I should have planted them in the evening and not in the morning, because they just weren't able to make it through the heat of that day. So even little things like that you learn as you start trying to put these things into practice. But my goal with this episode today was to give you some inspiration and ideas on what you can plant next, because I don't want you to be in the position where you're harvesting your cool season crops and you have this bare land and you're not sure what to do with it. I want you to get more out of your garden because we are in the middle of June. The garden season, in some cases, is just beginning, depending on where you're located. You have so much more that you can get out of your garden this season, whether it's another planting of summer crops like we talked about today, or you're looking forward to the fall garden. You have so much more left that you can do this year. And this is why I wanted to give you some ideas of some warm and hot season crops that you can plant now that your cool season crops have harvested. But as I said, always take this into context with your particular climate. Take these concepts and apply them to how they will fit in your context. And above all, I just hope that these ideas have inspired you today and are getting you thinking a little bit more into what you can plant to make your garden last longer throughout the season. Thank you so much, as always, for joining me on this episode of the Beginner's Garden Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to write a review and submit a rating on iTunes. This will help this podcast get into the hands of more beginning gardeners and more veteran gardeners maybe who would like extra ideas on their garden. And if you enjoy watching and getting examples of how these concepts can work in your garden, you can find me on YouTube at The Beginner's Garden Journey with Jill. I actually just posted a video that talked about what to plant after broccoli. Many of these concepts are going to be familiar to you, but you're going to see in action how I'm doing it in my garden. So if you're a YouTube watcher, check it out at The Beginner's Garden Journey with Jill. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful for you, and I hope you have a fabulous middle of your June season.